Hey guys, and welcome back to episode 21 of Breaking the Cycle. We have with us today Jason Meyer, who is the author of a pretty cool book that we have been talking about, and Grind has actually finished in a pretty quick amount of time for reading speed. I was amazed by that, but so you can tell he's the one who went to college with a group of us. But anyways, I'm going to let him kind of go ahead and kick off this intro and introduce you. Thank you so much for coming on, Jason. We really appreciate it, buddy.
Yeah,
And
thank you.
Yeah.
enjoy, guys.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you, Jason, for coming on. We are excited to have you on here. As your book kind of outlines right from the beginning, you get into your introduction as to why you wrote the book and what you hope to achieve in the book. So that's where we're going to start here with our first question. We wanted to give you the opportunity to give us a summary and overview as to why you wrote the book, what were the goals you hope to accomplish. You did a fantastic job of outlining it in the introduction, but let's get an elevator pitch for the audience on how your book can be a tool to orange pill people.
Yeah, thanks. First of all, thanks for having me, guys. I've been looking forward to the conversation, and I'm happy to be here.
Yeah.
So my book is called A Progressive's Case for Bitcoin, and I realized as I went down the Bitcoin rabbit hole that people that were in my life, my colleagues and coworkers and neighbors and family members who I would want to orange pill, were going to sort of face this political hurdle that they were going to have to get over because they just didn't align probably with a lot of the resources that exist out there. And the book really stemmed from a desire to be able to educate people who probably don't have a lot of resources that are directed precisely towards them in the Bitcoin space. So, there's this saying, I never had written a book before, but there's saying like, if there's a book out there you want to read and it doesn't exist, then you should write it. When about trying to write a book where I try to educate people about Bitcoin from a 0 to 1 level, just sort of get them into the basics of it, understand how it works, get a real conviction for the technology. And then from there, they can sort of continue their journey if they hopefully the book is persuasive and it convinces them that Bitcoin is important and that they should be learning about it. But in a way that sort of speaks their language, doesn't turn them off, doesn't do any name calling or make people feel bad about themselves, and just sort of is a resource for people that are left of center, progressive, liberal, however you want to put it. And that was really the goal of the book. And really what I find is that no matter what priority somebody has, if they think that there's something wrong with the world or they want to see the world operating in a better way, then you can probably find an avenue to introduce Bitcoin to that person. And that's what I'm trying to do with the book.
Yeah. And after reading the entirety of it, I would say that you've accomplished that goal, at least in my humble opinion, because that's exactly what drew me to your book, because I think I first heard of you when you were on the What Bitcoin Did podcast with Peter McCormick. And that was before the book had come out. You were in the process of writing it and trying to figure that all out. And the first thing that I said in my head, because I would say about 80% of my family is on the liberal progressive side of the political spectrum, and I was like, oh my god, this is going to be perfect. Now maybe they'll actually listen to me at some point.
Right.
So yeah, you did do a fantastic job of like not name calling and laying it out very respectfully, and I give you a lot of kudos for that, because it can be hard in this political divide that we're having in this country right now to even start to like broach the conversation. And I really implore anybody who's listening to this that maybe has some people who have really like put their foot down on not wanting to discuss Bitcoin, to maybe use this as the tool to open up that door.
Yep, it's very, very well done, very respectful. Even as a conservative mind reading it, I'm like, he was treaded very carefully, and like Peter McCormick said, I think this is even more important for conservatives to read this book. That's why I picked it up.
Well, that was going to be my next question is do you have a lot of conservatives that come to you and speak to you about the book? Because obviously everyone's going to have their own differences politically, right? That's what makes this country great. We have in writing that you have the ability to believe what you want to believe, and you have freedom of speech. And we have the ability to have this open dialogue where Beardy and I may be on complete opposite ends of the spectrum, but we have the right to speak to each other about our opinions, right? Like, have you noticed a lot of conservatives coming up to you and helping bridge that gap between, like, I don't like you because you're blue and my red side tells me not to, or, something like that?
Yeah, I mean, it's been an interesting journey through the Bitcoin space, right? Like, the way I try to sort of contextualize it is that everybody is in their own echo chamber, and now I get to be part of two different echo chambers. I'd like to believe that I'm out, like I found a way to get out of echo chambers completely, but I'm sort of into, and from that perspective, you can kind of see the people in my Bitcoin echo chamber, and the people in this sort of liberal Democrat, echo chamber. Quite often there's overlap there that they just can't see because they don't allow it, right? Like, whatever systems are in place and whatever sort of narrative that they want to believe, people just don't want to listen to the other side. But you can see there's overlap, and what I find amazing is that I've written a book about Bitcoin. People are really excited about it. I think and I hope it's a good tool to orange pill people. And there's been a lot of people who consider themselves conservative who absolutely say, I don't agree with you politically, but I can see what you're trying to do for Bitcoin. I see that you're trying to educate people and get more people on board. And so there's been a lot of support from Bitcoiners generally, even if they don't agree with me politically, because there's value in an educational resource out there that speaks to people in a way that, like, resonates with them, as opposed to sort of saying, all right, well, I'm gonna get you on board with Bitcoin, but you have to change these other 5 beliefs that you have first. Like, I'm trying to go about it in a different way. So yeah, there's been a lot of support. There's also been a lot of people who've sort of written me off completely already, right? Like, fortunately, there's been a lot more people who've been supportive and understanding and want to, like, contribute to the project or talk about it than the other way, and I'm very grateful for that.
Yeah, Jason, have you found that Bitcoin is almost like the great mediator? To me, I almost see Bitcoin as a point where it doesn't matter what side you're on. There's so many key points that both, the conservative side and liberal side can agree on with Bitcoin and what it can do. To me, I've almost turned Bitcoin itself into my political ideology. It's such a powerful tool. I'm guessing you may have found that yourself.
Yeah, I think that I do think that Bitcoin is a different lens through which to look at problems. I mean, a lot of when you really boil it down, doesn't matter what political side you're on. Like, you see the world and you think, all right, well, things could be doing, we could be running things better than they are. Things could be going better than they are. So anybody who sees the world as it is and sees, all right, well, how do we improve it? How do we change it? How do we make the world more like the world that we want? Bitcoin is a tool for that. And I think that there's more overlap between right and left than we think. There's certainly very important and key differences, but I think that unfortunately we're not able to have productive, like, respectful dialogues about most of those things that are actually important, things that we should be arguing about. But it's surprising the number of things that we probably agree on if we could just sort of get out of each other's way and actually talk about the issues in an honest and respectful way. Bitcoin does give you sort of a lever to do that. For example, I talk to conservative people because that's most of the Bitcoin space. And what I find is, like, I can go about having a conversation with a person who I don't agree with politically, but if we both know that we're Bitcoiners and that we agree on that, then we know that we're engaging in a good faith conversation. So we're not trying to score political points or, like I said, name call or sort of just do a cheap shot. We're thinking about things deeply. We want to get to, like, a common ground if there is one. And the conversation is just more productive and efficient and respectful if you have two Bitcoiners on different sides of the table. And I found that time and time again. So I think that in an aspirational sense, Bitcoin provides that lens to just sort of bridge the gap, maybe not on all issues because there are substantive disagreements that are important to talk about, but at least on some of the stuff that the people in charge want us fighting about, there's definitely a lot of overlap and common ground to find.
Yeah,
I would
for
I
sure.
would argue real quick just before you start your next question, Grind, that Bitcoin has created almost like its own echo chamber that everyone's welcome in. If that makes sense, like we can all, like you said, we can all politically disagree, but we're at the end of the day, we're all in Bitcoin and we all believe in the same thing at the same core. Like I think that most Bitcoiners want, like human rights issues, like are something that are very important to all of us. Like there's 80% of what makes Bitcoin, like everyone agrees with, if that makes sense. You know what I mean? Like we all have the same kind of set of core values that we all seem to stick to. And then it's just the outliers. And the outliers are always going to be outliers, right? I mean, we can always have disagreements, but at the end of the day, if we all agree that Bitcoin is making the world a better place, that's where we're going to have common ground and move towards.
Yeah.
I think that's a Martin Luther King principle where we all draw little circles, and then eventually you just draw a big giant circle around everybody else who's drawing a circle around themselves.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, moving right along. So we love that you start out with the what is money topic in chapter 2 of Why Bitcoin and defining it for the readers, because let's face it, we don't really learn financial literacy, quote unquote, in the American school system, at least. So what my question to you in regards to that is, what are the biggest hurdles that you see with individuals having to understand our money and the monetary system from discussions that you've had with them?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the you know the biggest hurdle in a sense is precisely that question, like what is money? And I think that it's remarkable how much we interact with money all the time, and people think that they understand it, but when you really press them for a definition, they get it wrong, or they say, "Oh, I haven't really thought about it like that." So
Hmm.
certainly, 99% of people out there, maybe 95% of people out in the world, are just living their life, and they just think money is what the government gives you to spend and save and invest. And so when you really drill down and think about the definition of money, understand that money is a technology and improvements should be expected on any technological medium, and that
Yeah.
money should be a tool that works. And then what is the definition of money, and what are the properties that make something a good money? When you really start to break it down and you realize, hey, it doesn't have to be issued by a government. There's nothing in the definition that says you have to be able to hold it in your hand. In fact, most people don't hold money in their hand on a day-to-day, no matter what.
Mm.
You start to break down those misconceptions, right? Like, oh, well, Bitcoin isn't real and Bitcoin can't be money because it's not from the government. You just sort of like knock down those dominoes one at a time, and you sort of start from a fresh slate and say, okay, well, if we go down on a definitional level, like what is money, now build up what would be a good money, and you realize that Bitcoin fits the definition. It actually fits all of the properties that make something a good money, and you can kind of like start from a clean slate. That's why it's at the beginning of the book, because otherwise they're just people are hung up on the idea that like it can't be money if it doesn't say United States of America across the top of it, and just breaking that down is like step number one, I think.
Yeah, and you do a great job of explaining that in this chapter. You break down money into like 7 components. And I'd like to read a quote that you said in this chapter where you're like, Bitcoin is not just a little, uh, but a lot more durable, portable, divisible, agreeable, scarce, and verifiable. These aren't properties I cherry picked because they make Bitcoin look good. These are the old textbook properties economists have used for good money forever.
Hmm.
And yeah, I mean, it's just like that's the understanding that I think a lot of people have to come to. And again, you do a great job of like introducing people to that idea, and then maybe if they want more information, they go beyond this. And I know personally when somebody comes trying to have a conversation about Bitcoin, and they're like, oh, but like some people think that that's a Ponzi scheme or whatever, and I'll be like, do you understand what fractional reserve banking is? And it's like, define that to me. Tell me what that means to you. And a majority of the time, they don't even really understand that term. And then explaining that, and then going into like showing the differences between those two. And it's like, which one looks more like a Ponzi scheme to you?
Right. Right. And I mean, we all know Ponzi scheme gets thrown around a lot and never accurately about Bitcoin, right? Like
Mm,
you say, what's the definition of a Ponzi scheme? And you think about something like, government bonds and debt versus Bitcoin, and you can realize it's just not applicable. Like there's lots of reasons to be skeptical of Bitcoin. And I encourage people to be skeptical as you learn, right? Like it's the
mhm.
intersection of the internet and money, and everyone should be skeptical when that happens. But you can't be dismissive, and you can't just throw around words like Ponzi scheme when you don't understand what a Ponzi
Right.
scheme is and how, like Bitcoin doesn't fit that. What you mean to say is like, you should be wary because it's internet and money. Well, sure, like learn more about it and keep learning and be skeptical, ask tough questions. Just don't be smugly dismissive and call it a Ponzi scheme because you're going to be left out, and it doesn't make you look very intelligent because you're not getting the definitions right.
Yeah, exactly. And that kind of ties in nicely to in the last chapter you have like a call to action section, and you talk about the idea of if have you ever heard of somebody who's put 100 hours of research into Bitcoin and still been skeptical of it or still putting it down? And I wasn't saying 100 hours. I usually say 50 hours to people, but we can double it. I'm fine with that. But yeah, it's like the same thing. I tell people, just start doing some research. If you put 50 hours in and you still think that uh it's not for you, then at least I can respect that. But when you're just going off of like what mainstream media says in like a 3-minute segment once every 4 years because everybody gets excited when the all-time highs are coming in, that's not really a great place to formulate an opinion.
Right. Agreed.
Awesome. So in chapter 3, which is titled "Why Bitcoin is Good for the Environment," you do emphasize that this is the largest chapter of your book, and you focus on the debunking of the myths around the Bitcoin energy use. Um, I think that is crucial for converting those who are energy conscious or green environmentalists. We love how you focus on, and then I have a quote: consider the environmental impact in the context of the vast social and economic benefits that technology can provide mankind. And so, what have you seen is the most effective way to induce a quote unquote light bulb moment for many naysayers who go on to change their perspective with this for Bitcoin?
Yeah, I think that the real challenge, and again, like having, like I can relate to this because this is where I was before I dove into Bitcoin, right? Like it's
Uh-huh.
very easy for somebody to be consider themselves an environmentalist and then hear that X is bad for the environment, it wastes energy, and then sort of stop your thinking at that point. It's like that's what I did, like I very smugly told my friend when he was into Bitcoin, like, yeah, I heard it's bad for the environment, like I'm out.
Mm,
And then the reality is what you need to do is just get somebody past the like using energy equals bad equation, like because that's not necessarily true. There's more nuance. Like certainly there are things that you can waste energy on that are bad and that you shouldn't be doing it. And there's
yeah.
more efficient ways to do it. But I think understanding that not only energy use, but how is energy being generated? How is it being transported? How is it being stored? What are the limitations on renewables? What are the limitations on traditional fossil fuel types of energy? And really understanding a bigger picture, and saying like, here is a technology that allows us to disentangle like a lot of privilege that the traditional financial sector has. It's leaving people out. Like we can actually like have censorship resistant money that is really a key to freedom of speech. Like we have all of these benefits, and if we can allocate a certain percentage of the energy that we use towards Bitcoin, then we get all of those benefits. And there's also like uniquely because of the structure of Bitcoin, positive incentives that go towards renewable energy and sort of
Yeah.
stabilizing the grid and all of those things. Like the picture is just much more rich and dynamic than a lot of people would like to think, right? Like and quite honestly, there are people who say like, I don't need to worry about the environment. I think ESG is a scam. I think that none of this stuff is man-made. I don't need to worry about it. And there's people who are like, anything that uses energy, I'm going to be skeptical of. I'm not going to think about it. the reality is that we have to find a middle, because these things are complicated, and a lot of people don't understand how energy is, generated, transmitted, sold, used, stored, and you can't really have a clear picture on the energy use and whether something's worth it or not, or whether something's actually green or not, without understanding all of those different pieces. So it's really just a way to educate people on all of those nuances, and that's what I try to do in the chapter, without turning them off or calling them stupid because they care about the environment or whatever. It's just sort of like, here's something you care about. Let's dig into it a little bit so you can have like the small details that are going to make a difference in you understanding what the full picture is.
We actually did an episode with SAS Mining. If you get a chance and want to check that out. But I was amazed at how far it's come, because I was one of the things that I had heard growing up, when I was younger, is Bitcoin's bad for the environment. It wastes a bunch of energy, and it's going to melt the trees and the oceans and, whatever the horror, doom and gloom, whatever they were saying at that time. And then we talked to Kent over at SAS Mining, and he's like, oh no, they want us to come down here and use this because otherwise they have to give this energy away for free to Brazil. So they want us down here mining because it helps their economy and it stimulates, and we're 100% hydro. And like, he goes through all of this stuff, and I'm like, I don't understand how this, this is still a thing that people are saying it, after hearing him go into depth about that. So if you get a chance, it'd be great. I think you'd like that episode.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm a customer of SAS Mining and absolutely love what they're doing, and I think that it's a great way to mine Bitcoin and have like a renewable energy source, with hydro. So
I didn't realize that you had done all that. That's really cool.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So and Kent is great. So like, that's great that you had a conversation with them, and I think it's just anything that can be done to move the narrative past the soundbite, like, this is bad for the environment, I'm scoring political points with my supporters, into a more nuanced conversation is really important. And that's what I tried to do in the book. It's just not something that you can explain in 30 or 60 seconds, right? Like, it actually takes a little bit of work. You have to dive into it, and you have to want to know what the truth is, not just what your political side is telling you, like, oh, just care about this one thing, and then you can walk away from it and not think about it anymore. It takes a little bit more work. So
that's kind of how I was with Tesla. And I don't know if you follow Tesla a lot, but in Texas, I had just recently found out that for $25 a month, you can get unlimited overnight charging. And it's all through renewables, right? So and I was looking at it and I was like, why aren't we talking about this? Why isn't this more of a thing? It's all through renewable energy, and it's $25 a month for overnight charging. For a lot of people, that will save them tens of thousands of dollars a month, and, helps with, we won't go down the rabbit hole of environmentalism. I'm not like a hardcore environmentalist. I think that we should, do our best to protect Earth and all that, like use less plastic, blah, blah, blah. But it was amazing to me. So I don't get why we're not talking more about how, these renewable energies are actually a thing and really are helping.
Right. And I think something like that, where you have like overnight, pricing or whatever, like you're talking about like choosing when you plug something in as a way to like do demand responses. Like, liberals and progressives are already on board with this, right? Like, get a smart dishwasher, like charge your car at night, whatever it is. Like, it makes sense to use energy in smart ways. Bitcoin mining is incentivized to do that automatically. And I think that one of the things that, is surprising to a lot of the readers of my book, when I mention like things like negatively priced energy, right? Like, there are moments and times and places where electricity has a negative price. They pay you to take it. And that can only happen if, like, you can only make sense of that when you understand like that, like, not all electricity created at all times in, across the world is considered equal, right? Like, there are times where there's more energy being produced than is demanded. And I think that all of those kinds of things are important to understand. So the idea that sometimes, you can get really cheap electricity at night, but in the day is expensive. Like, that's the thing. People don't think about that usually. They just think using energy is bad. And I think that the goal is to try to get it more of a nuanced approach. So that's great.
Yeah. And like when I talk to people about the environmental angle and the energy use angle, a lot of times people are, when they want to protect the environment, they go to the idea of like let's address CO2. And what I like to kind of bring to their attention is like, okay, I agree with you. Like CO2 is a problem, and like we got to do stuff to mitigate that. But what do you know about methane? And methane is so much worse that so many multiples more than CO2. And then I go into the discussion of how Bitcoin miners can take that those flared gases and use that energy and get something back rather than waste. And like, if that's the whole message of this is, we shouldn't be wasting energy, we should be optimizing it. This is a way that we can optimize that. And then on top of that, we can build a banking system on that potentially removes the banking system that currently uses more energy than Bitcoin mining. And then being a licensed professional counselor, my job is essentially to challenge people's cognitive dissonance on a regular basis with CBT and whatnot. So I like to point out the hypocrisies, right? So if somebody says like, "Oh, Bitcoin mining's bad because of X, Y, and Z," I'll say like, "Oh, so you must be hang drying all your clothes," and then they'll say, "What do you mean?" And I'm like, "Because clothes dryers across the world use more energy than Bitcoin mining. Were you aware of that?" Little things like that I think can start to shed that light and be like, if you believe this, then practice what you preach. And,
Right.
yeah, so
No, it's great. I mean, these are like I said, the unfortunate part is like there's no 30-second version of that conversation, right? Like
exactly.
it takes a long time, and somebody has to be willing to receive it. And if they are, for better or worse, if they're talking to somebody who is just going to sort of disavow climate change or like say, whatever, like you're just not going to learn from somebody that disagrees with you on something that you think is so important. So having, a voice out there who can speak to people and say, "Hey, I understand why you feel so strongly about this. I do too. And here's the nuance that you need to be aware of." It goes off. It's usually more successful. So, and that's been the hope, and that's been my experience with the book. So.
Excellent. So moving right along, chapter 4, you talk about Bitcoin and banks. When discussing the U.S. banking system with opponents to Bitcoin, what do you what have you found to be like the most egregious falsehood that supporters of banking typically hold or fail to recognize within that system, and then are shocked or surprised when they find out the truth?
That's a great question. I think that what I find is people in the target audience for the book, which is essentially people who don't know much about Bitcoin yet, but they're interested, and consider themselves left of center, progressive, or liberal. They're already skeptical of banks, right? Like, it's not like I need to teach them that like banks are bad, right? They're not in support of the banks. They just don't trust that Bitcoin is a viable alternative to the things that they see wrong in the banking system, right? Which is like the relationship between the government and big banks, how big banks mistreat customers. They don't service like low income neighborhoods, like all of those things. I think that, if you're sort of a card carrying liberal, like you already are on board, like, yeah, banks are not doing good for most people. It's just really convincing them to say like, hey, like from its inception, Bitcoin has been a protest against like big banks and the relationship between government and banks, and really gives in a way that we've never seen before, regular people an opportunity to be involved in sort of custodying their own money and saving their own money and the fruits of their labor without relying on one of these institutions that we have to rely on now. And I think that, to answer your question maybe a little bit more specifically, like things that surprise people is really understanding that if you're using Venmo, and even though it feels like my money is going from my phone to your phone directly and instantaneously, like that's not true. Like that money is going through several banks. Each one of those banks is an opportunity to have that transaction, terminated, confiscated, stopped. It's an opportunity for your information to be leaked somewhere else that you don't want. And Bitcoin is actually a technology that will go from my phone to your phone, and it will be instant, and it will seem like it does for Venmo, but it's actually much different. So underneath the hood, how do those institutions and how does that technology work? Bitcoin is a completely different option than like a Venmo or a PayPal. And certainly there's no shortage of people who have like horror stories with like PayPal suspended my account for this reason, right? It's like
Oh yeah.
all of those problems, like Bitcoin solves those things. So there's some things with like when technology removes the user from sort of like what's happening under the hood and it seems seamless, but it's really not. That's like a recipe for trouble. So I think highlighting the fact that like even though you can pay for your cup of coffee and avocado toast to your friend instantly, like that's not actually what's happening. Here's what's really happening. That's eye-opening for some people, but I'm not really going up against bankers who are supporting the banking industry. I think most people are like, yeah, well, banks are shitty, but like what can we do, right? Like that's just the way it is. And for the first time, offering an alternative to people to say, hey, like this is actually a viable option, and here are the ways that we can be using Bitcoin instead.
I got a hot take, Jason.
Yeah.
So how does Elizabeth Warren reconcile her position with the big banks and whatnot?
Yeah, she can't.
Yeah, right.
I think that's the key, right? Like she is railing against big banks, and I'd like to think maybe we give her the benefit of the doubt. Like she genuinely like understands the dangers that big banks have against regular people. That's probably not true. She's just scoring political points. She's railing against Bitcoin to score political points, and what she fails to see is that those two things are diametrically opposed to one another. If you actually are an opponent of big banks and how they mistreat people and like abuse customers, then you should be in favor of Bitcoin, or at the very least have a more thoughtful critique of Bitcoin than what she's providing now, right? Like, you know, I would respect it a little bit more if she said, hey, I hate big banks and I understand Bitcoin's trying to do this, but here's where it's failing. That's more respectful dialogue than just sort of being against Bitcoin. So there's no way, Beardy, really, there's no way to reconcile the, Elizabeth Warren's stance on this. And who knows where she's going to land. She's going to have to pick one or the other, but she can't have both forever. And hopefully she comes down to the realization that Bitcoin is helpful, but I'm not holding my breath for that.
You mean that the politician who talks out of both sides of their mouth and doesn't actually decide on an issue and just wants money from everyone? What?
Yeah.
No way.
So you're saying she may or may not be compromised at the moment? I thought she committed political suicide when she came out with her little anti-crypto army. I mean, I'm assuming she meant crypto to mean Bitcoin, but.
Well, yeah, and again, like we're at a stage now where that's not, to most people, that's not an obvious political suicide, but it will be soon. And I think that the narrative is shifting slowly, but like steadily. And 3, 4, 5 years from now, it's not like a politician come out against Bitcoin in that way, especially just sort of like in an unthoughtful surface level, way without any backing for it. So I don't think she thinks she committed political suicide. I think she's actually probably getting a lot of support from people who are uneducated about the issue. But that's why we're doing our part to try to educate people.
Yeah. And Jason, you put that so perfectly because that's like pretty much exactly what I said. When the day that she announced the anti-crypto army, I texted some members of my family and I was like, she just destroyed her political career and she doesn't even know it yet.
And Jason,
yep.
What have you found is the best way to outreach to actual people in political positions? Have you done any outreach work to try to actually change things legislatively?
Great question. I think that the short answer is kind of, but not really. I have done an event with Satoshi Action Fund and Orange Pill app. We went down and handed out copies of my book and a couple of others to politicians in DC. And that was actually really rewarding and an amazing experience. Certainly there's been people who have bought copies of my book for politicians that are local to them and have told me about that and thanked me for that, opportunity to engage in the conversation. It's important to note that the book is written with an audience, the audience in mind is the voter. I didn't come about the book because I was sort of offended as a political activist and said, well, we need a political liberal voice for Bitcoin. It was really genuinely from a place of education. Like, how can I reach people at where they are so they feel comfortable? And it's really speaking to the voter. So my stance personally is, if we convince enough voters, Elizabeth Warren or anybody like her is going to follow the money until they can't anymore. And then eventually the voters are going to have to step up and tell her, like, she's wrong about this thing. So that's what I'm trying to do with the book. Now, I got a great, DM from somebody in Canada the other day who said, I have a relative who's a politician, and she happened to pick up a copy of your book when I was visiting, and I brought it with me. And she was really fascinated by, Bitcoin and sort of this new take on Bitcoin. So I think that in very subtle and small ways over time, the book is getting into the hand of politicians. And I think, if nothing else, is just shifting the Bitcoin into a topic that is allowed to be talked about, right? Like, this is now something that both sides of the aisle, there are supporters of it, and we should actually be engaging in a real conversation as opposed to just fighting over this political football. So I do see it happening, but I'm not a political operative. I'm like sort of just a pleb when it comes to politics. I just vote, and I think try to stay informed. But I don't have any strong connections to Washington or anything like that.
Excellent. Well, we definitely appreciate the work that you're doing, and it'll definitely help in the long run. I'm sure of that.
Yeah.
For sure.
All right. Yeah. So moving right along. In chapter 5, you discuss poor and marginalized people. One group more specifically, you talk about women in abusive relationships. I actually personally have a background in running a court-ordered male offenders domestic violence rehabilitation group. I saw firsthand how financial abuse was a way to control their victims, one of the ways. And they can also, as another tactic, limit the victim's access to technology. And so my question to you is, with this restriction that can hinder a victim's ability to learn about Bitcoin and its possibility as an escape hatch for them, what would you suggest nonprofits or government programs that assist victims with domestic violence do to provide educational resources about Bitcoin to these populations if a pilot program was created?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. This is something that I care about quite a bit. And I can say I've been in talks with people who are local to my community, women's support service groups that are doing really great work for people that need it. And this is an issue that affects every race and class, across the country in every neighborhood. And what's surprising, I think, a very large percentage of people who suffer physical abuse from their partner are also experiencing this financial abuse, which, they don't have full knowledge about income or, expenditures. They're purposely being misled or told lies about the status of their finances, and not given education just generally, not about Bitcoin, but just generally about how to be on your own, and like, how do you budget, and how do you invest money, and how do you open a bank account? And so all of these things keep the victim dependent on the abuser. And it's important to first of all shed light on that. But second of all, there are organizations that are doing really great work to support people in this position. And what I've found in conversations is that the big hurdle is that these organizations, whether they're non-for-profit, government, not government, are understaffed and overworked, right? They're trying to do more than they really have the facilities and the infrastructure to do. And so what we really need is, and again, I might not be the only person to talk about this. Of course, there's other people who can speak more eloquently about it, but we need people who are able and willing to volunteer their time to educate people, have, for example, a battery of hardware wallets that can't be tracked or can't be confiscated by an abuser. So if somebody wants to leave, for example, they can go to a women's support services organization and, be given tutorials about how to use Bitcoin, how to save in Bitcoin, and how to leave a relationship that needs to be, a person needs to leave from, and have the basics of understanding of how can you have money that can't be tracked by your abuser, so like they can't find you. How can you save in a way that can't be taken from you? All of these things, and ideally, you might be able to be in a position. Some women would be in a position to sort of secretly save on the side, and not, their abuser might not know it. Other people are not in that position. So there's a lot of different dynamics at play. But really, I think it comes about, educating the people who are doing this work and understanding that Bitcoin is a tool, or a potential tool, making sure that they know enough to be able to set up hardware wallets and distribute them in a way. We obviously need funding and donations to do that. And essentially helping people that can be helped in that situation. It might not be, I say this pretty clearly in the book, like this doesn't solve all of the problems, but
Right.
If we're not thinking about this as part of the solution, then we're missing a big piece of it. Money is such an important tool in our society that if somebody can control your finances, then they can control a lot of what you do. And this is just one group of many that is sort of held down in those ways. And it'd be a very, I've been involved in many conversations, both personally and hearing about other people having this conversation too, chipping away at well, we can't ever do that because it's too complicated, or we don't have the funding, or we don't have the time. People are chipping away at those things locally, like in their communities. And I think that I would love to just encourage people to do that if they have the capacity to.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that this is something that will get easier for people to digest over time as, people get older and the younger generations come more into, that primary demographic, just as people get older, they'll be able to potentially, understand the nuances, and it will feel more second nature to them rather than somebody who's maybe like never really had access to the internet.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, awesome. Before we go on to the next question, Jason, I just want to let you know that you have like a little hair or piece of fuzz on the bottom of your beard,
Oh,
and I just didn't want you to have to.
well, thank you.
I would want somebody to tell me.
Appreciate the help.
Yeah, no worries. So yeah, chapter 6, you talk about inflation. And we believe the most attention the concept of inflation has received in our times has been in the last 2 years following the pandemic. As a clinical mental health counselor, I assist clients with challenging that cognitive dissonance as a symptom of the human condition, as I mentioned before. How do we assist those misled by, and I know that this might be a little bit of a strong word, indoctrination of the inflation is good, or the Keynesian economics only views that our country and or global society has about how economics function?
Yeah, I think that it's a hurdle, like I describe in the book. Like somebody I was talking to who teaches economics, who's all on board. Like I actually said, like, I'm going to describe Bitcoin to you and you tell me what the problem is. And he was like, no, everything that you said is absolutely great. Like the only thing that doesn't work is like the fact that it's not inflationary currency and the monetary base doesn't inflate. And so you die, like people are already like clued into it. I think it's almost easier now because across America right now, people are realizing like, oh wow, like no matter what income level you are, you're actually like having to take a look at your monthly expenditures and figure out like, oh, I can't just sort of like go to the grocery store and not think about it anymore, or whatever.
Yeah.
Like maybe if you're at a higher income level, you're just like, oh, I can't just take a vacation without thinking. Wherever you are, I think that you're feeling the effect of these rising prices that have been going up over the last couple of years. So I think that it's on one hand, it's a natural sell to say to somebody like, look, you're working just as hard, you're making the same amount of money, and yet everything else is, the prices of everything are going up, and that's not fair to you. And like, but the problem that I think, and the answer to your question that I have, is a lot of people just think that it's built in. It's like a law of nature. It has to happen. There's nothing we can do about it. They see, even if they see personally it affects them in a negative way, they don't necessarily view it as a problem that can be solved. It's just a fact of nature. And so to disavow them of that, like say, hey, like here's why we see inflation. Here's what causes it. Here's who it benefits. Here's why it can't really go away in the system that we have now. It's just not a negative add-on to a healthy system. It's needed to make the current system actually operate. Otherwise, everything implodes. You start having a different conversation, right? People start thinking about inflation in a different way. It's not just, oh, the price of my ground beef has gone up and I don't like that. It's actually like, well, what's causing those price increases, and why do the people who run the system need that to happen? Otherwise, the system implodes. That's a much different conversation than, oh, inflation it's too bad that prices are going up, but what can we do about it? It's like the banks, right? Like exactly what I said with the banks, where people are like, oh yeah, I don't like the banks, but like there's no other option. It's the same thing with inflation. Once you start to view the problem through a Bitcoin lens, and you can actually kind of take it apart and see that there's actually different ways to go about it and different priorities that we can set with our monetary technologies.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Excellent. Okay.
Hey, Jason. Hey,
Yeah,
sorry,
go,
Grind.
go.
Just
No.
out of curiosity, Jason, so for me personally, I really view Bitcoin as the ultimate saving system. I think of it as the ultimate store of value with nothing better possible. Do you see Bitcoin as like truly something that we should be using as pure currency, or do you see it as something like that as a store of value that possibly we could base currency on?
Yeah, I have room in my worldview for both options. I think that Bitcoin is going through right now what you sort of consider an adoption arc that starts with store of value, and certainly that's most people are using it in that way. Especially in America, they view it as a store of value, how to preserve your wealth, how to preserve your labor. Without it being, debased, and that's obviously a hugely important use case for Bitcoin. And I can envision a world in which, as adoption goes up and through the years, we start seeing it more as a medium of exchange and a unit of account, but that follows a pretty predictable arc, and we're just not there yet. And you see people like, pretty hardcore Bitcoiners right now are using Bitcoin. That's not a problem, and certainly they do, but we need more scaling technology, and we need more adoption for that to happen. We need more price stability for that to happen. I also can envision a world in which, Bitcoin does not eliminate fiat currency, but is a check on fiat currency, so that you can say, all right, well, United States dollar, if you don't get your act together and stop, inflating my savings away and debasing the monetary supply, then I have an option. Like, we've never had a release valve before. And so I can see that, fiat currency being backed by Bitcoin. I can see fiat currency being in check and operating in a more honest and transparent way because of Bitcoin. Or I can see people using Bitcoin ultimately in the future. So, I don't have, I'm not going to nail down like a hard thing, but I can see any one of those options happening, and they're all better than the system that we have right now.
Yep, agreed.
Yeah. And in that chapter, you also do a great job of like breaking down the basics of like how our money has changed over time, especially with, getting off the gold standard, and the impacts of that. So I think it's a really great like introduction to the history lesson on that for people who really want to understand money and how it works within the governments, and as like a world reserve currency.
Yeah, and I think it's just important. I kind of touched on this before, but I'll highlight it. Is that like money, the things that we use for money changes over time and place, and I think that a lot of people right now, if they're Americans, think about money in a very like isolated way, like it is the piece of paper that the government issues, or it is the numbers that are on my computer screen that my bank tells me I have. And the more we can get people to understand that, like, what we use as a monetary technology changes and has always changed over time, then the more open they are to understanding, well, okay, if what we use as money changes over time, you mentioned the gold standard and all of these changes that happen in like what the definition of a dollar is, then I'm more open to understanding, okay, well, what's the best form of money and how can we get there? And so I think that's an important step in educating people.
Yeah, for sure. Excellent. Okay, in chapter 8, you talk about Bitcoin and peace. And I have a quote that was pretty profound from that chapter that spoke to me. You said, "The obligation to pay for war instead of printing money forces governments to be more transparent with their citizenry about why a war is necessary and how it will be paid for. In our current system, central banks obfuscate the true cost of war by printing money. Please explain the importance of people understanding the differences the American people had with their connection to the cost of war during World War II and our current quote unquote armed conflicts since then."
Yeah, I think you know, in the book is a little bit of a case study about sort of the direct connections that that sort of the voting population in America had to, you know, World War II, like an armed conflict. People went and fought and died, and the nation paid a lot of money to go to war, versus sort of what we have now, which is sort of decades long. Not declared wars, but armed conflicts that are, you know, by all measures at this point, very unpopular,
Mm.
but still they're happening, right? And things like this have been happening throughout the decades. And I think that there's just a number of different ways in which the voting population, the people who are meant to hold the government accountable, have been removed from the dialogue into like, well, are we going to war? Where are we going? Why? Who's paying for it? How are we going to pay for it? Who's benefiting from it? The people who do the voting and the sort of the engaged populace isn't there anymore. And I think that, you know, I talk about in the book, you know, back in World War II, you had people who were like on rations, and they increased taxes, and they went and they sold war bonds, and and the government, like the elected representatives of the government, voted to declare war in World War II. Like there's all sorts of connections that connected the people to the actual conflict. People got drafted to go do the fighting and the dying and the killing, and I think all of that's been removed. All of the examples I just mentioned are no longer in place. So we have a
Yeah.
war that's happening very far away. It doesn't seem like it's costing anything because taxes haven't gone up. We're not being asked to pay war bonds. I can buy as much butter in the grocery store as I want, right? There's no
Right.
sacrifices at home. And so you end up with this disconnect. And all of that's possible because that we're printing the money to make that happen. And so there's a lot of different like reasons for that, and that it's pretty complicated, but ultimately it's a disconnection between the people who are doing the voting and the people who are making the decisions to go to war. That's not to speak of the complete, you know, inequity involvement. Well, who gets into the military now, who's doing the fighting and the dying, who's doing the
Hmm.
benefit, like what companies are benefiting from these conflicts, and how are they benefiting from it, and how are the bids for the government and getting paid and all of that stuff. Those are all complicated issues, but ultimately it comes down to like we have a broken monetary system that allows our government to print money to go to war without the people voting feeling any pain at all, and then therefore the war keeps going, right? The armed conflict keeps happening, and that's
Yeah.
one avenue to look at it, but it's a pretty important one. And so I just try to articulate those differences in that chapter, and sort of aspirationally think, well, what happens to armed conflict and war and you know those kinds of things if you have to use Bitcoin to pay for it? Like you just can't print more Bitcoin. People are going
Yeah.
to have to feel it one way or the other, which doesn't eliminate armed conflict, but it's certainly people will be more engaged and the government will be more responsive if the people are actually asked to sacrifice to go into an armed conflict.
Yeah. 100% agree with that. And yeah, very good explanation. Yeah, I worry about people losing the understanding of like what it means to make a sacrifice, whether it's a sacrifice for yourself, your family, your country, you know, some sort of ideology that you hold. By being disconnected from the money in this way, it doesn't really allow you to understand the choices that I think some of us are making by either supporting something that we don't realize that we're supporting, or, you know, not having that voice.
Right.
Yeah. All right. And that brings us to our last question here. In chapter 9, you talk about Bitcoin and governance. Our
Mhm.
country is arguably the most divided we have seen in our lifetime. How do we get individuals to stop the noise of red versus blue and focus on increasing the transparency of what the government is actually doing and how it can damage both sides? It seems like this distraction was part of the plan for those in power all along, maybe. Yes or no?
Yeah.
Can I throw my 2 cents on this real quick?
Yeah.
Sure.
I think he's going to say Bitcoin, and I 100% agree with him if he says yes.
I think
Sorry,
that
Jason. Sorry, buddy.
no, it's fine. I try to think about it, and ultimately, like the institutions that we have in government are ultimately they're just people, right? Like it's just
Yeah.
human
Yeah.
beings making choices, and I just think that it seems to resonate more for me to attribute like the division and the sort of like like the chasm between right and left and all of that stuff and the distractions that we have in our political arena. It's not sort of like this grand plan that was like premeditated and sort of like there was some conspiracy to get people divided and to get them distracted on unimportant things. I just think it's really the system has incentivized that behavior, right? We have 24-hour news channels that have to get filled, and like you just realize over time, if you look back on it, like it's more profitable to like just target one kind of person, one audience. And so the same thing is true for politicians. I think over time we've grown apart, and the politicians are speaking a language that resonates with only some people, and there's this tribalism involved. So there's a lot of problems. I don't necessarily know that it's part of like a master plan where like in the back room somewhere, Elizabeth Warren and Mitch McConnell love each other and they just sort of figuring out how to screw over people. But I do think that the incentives that are in place, right? If you want to get money and you want to get elected and you want to get votes, like this is the best way to do it. And unfortunately, that's sort of dividing the people. So I do think that there's an important distinction. The answer isn't, it's a little bit more nuanced than Bitcoin. I think that Bitcoin does provide a bridge, and it provides a way for people to transcend those categories that they've always been attached to. And that's really important. But in order to get somebody into Bitcoin, and this is I guess, the thesis behind the book, right? In order for me to get somebody who's progressive or liberal into Bitcoin, I still need to approach them from their category because that's where they feel comfortable. They feel comfortable in the category of, I'm a left-leaning progressive person who votes for Democrats, and I'm not going to like totally disavow that just so I can learn about Bitcoin. Really, my stance is Bitcoin can transcend those political categories, but in order to get somebody into Bitcoin, you have to approach them from where they already are. So I do think that in the long run, you can transcend that. You can sort of bridge the divide. You can find common ground. You can have more productive debates about issues and topics that there are disagreements about if you can do all of that. But first, you need to get people into Bitcoin by approaching them from where they are and understanding that they feel very comfortable in their categories and with their labels, and sort of not tell them, and this is true for people on both sides or any sort of side of the political spectrum, like you just want to meet them where they are and understand what's important to them so that they can sort of learn about this technology. And if they choose to transcend their political categories at that point, or hold their elected representatives accountable to learn about Bitcoin, which is what I hope happens, then that's really like the best that we can hope for. Say, okay, I've learned about Bitcoin and I'm going to stop voting for you unless you learn about it and you figure out what your stance is. I think that's what my trajectory is and what I hope for other people.
Jason, I just wanted to thank you for that visual of the love triangle of Elizabeth Warren, Mitch McConnell, and Gary Gensler.
Who knows what happens when those three get into a room, right?
Right. We have no idea. Well, yeah, Jason, I love that answer. And the way that I would kind of sum it up is, I see your book as a Trojan horse for those individuals. We can put the book in there and say like, hey, we're, just give it a read and maybe you'll change your mind. And I think you will convince a lot of people to kind of change their perspective. So I really appreciate you taking the time to come out and talk with us today. Not only because it's Labor Day weekend, but you are a teacher, and my wife used to be a teacher, and I know what it's like those first couple of weeks preparing your classroom and all that jazz. So I was surprised when you wanted to come on this weekend, because I was like, he's got to be busy.
I'm actually, and this is worth noting. My school has given me a sabbatical this year to go and promote the book. So my colleagues are back to work, and I'm very happily not. So you've caught me in a very good weekend, because all of my friends are teaching and prepping their classrooms, and I am on here talking to you, and absolutely stress-free. So happy to be here and happy to talk about Bitcoin and happy to promote the book, because that's what I'm supposed to be doing with my year.
Well, that's awesome. I really appreciate you making us part of your sabbatical and your mission here.
I got 2 heavy-hitting questions for him, rapid fire.
Yeah.
Jason, what's your favorite color?
Blue.
And then I always ask the guys, what's your wife think about all this?
That's a good question. My wife is supportive of Bitcoin. She gets it. We had to have very close communication about the process of writing the book and what it means for our family. But she is overall very supportive. And, she actually hooked me up out here. She's like, why don't I hook up your computer outside? You have a nice interview. It's a nice day. So she's all on board. She's out there encouraging me to buy more Bitcoin and stuff. So best wife you could hope for in terms of a Bitcoin spouse, for sure.
Everyone's got this amazing spouse that's encouraging them to buy Bitcoin, and I can't even get a date.
Don't worry, Joe. It's coming, buddy.
It's coming, buddy.
Yeah.
Let me rephrase that. I can get a date, but it's not with who I want.
Well, anybody can get a date, right? Yeah. But I think that it's important. Obviously, my origin story into Bitcoin, which I've told to other people, is my first buy was for $20 on PayPal, and I realized that I knew nothing about Bitcoin at all. I just knew my friend had encouraged me to buy it, and my initial reaction was oh no, if I lose this $20, I'm going to have to explain to my wife why I bought Bitcoin. I don't know. All of this that just happened was really just an offshoot of me making sure that I could explain to my wife why I bought Bitcoin and why it was worth it. And once you go down the rabbit hole, there's no turning back, right? So
Now, do you have any tours? Are you doing tours, or what? Do you want to plug one of those so we can help?
Oh yeah,
plug that for you.
I am doing mostly local stuff. I'm in Connecticut, so you'll see me. I'll be in Albany in October. I'm actually going to Bitcoin Amsterdam and Pacific Bitcoin to talk about the book there. So those are a couple of events on the calendar. And then mostly I'm going to be local to my community, right? So driving to Massachusetts, New York, Connecticut, those kinds of places to talk in bookstores and in libraries and things like that, just educate regular people about Bitcoin. And so, you pulled up my website a couple of times, but there's events up there. So if people are looking to find me in person, I always have my events listed.
Oh yeah, perfect.
Yep. Are you going to Nashville, Jason?
I haven't nailed it down. My assumption is that I'll be there. It's hard to imagine me not making a trip to Nashville, but I
want you to sign the book, but that's about how long it'll take me to read it.
Don't worry, audiobook is coming out soon too. But
thank God.
For those dyslexics among us, the audiobook is actually recorded right now. But yeah, so I'll probably be in Nashville, and if you see me in any one of these spots, I'm happy to always sign a book and shake a hand for sure.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on. We really appreciate it. And is there anything that you wanted to cover before we go? Or is there any questions that you wanted to maybe ask us, or that you wish someone had asked you?
No, I mean, really, I had a great conversation with you guys. I really appreciate it, and I think that obviously, we're all sort of mission aligned. We want to get Bitcoin into the hands of people and help them understand it. So, I appreciate you for your time, and it was a great talk. So, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. We'd love to have you back on at some point too, whenever
Oh,
you decide to write your second book, or hopefully before then.
Sure, you got
Sounds
it.
good.
Absolutely.
Thank
All
you,
right.
Jason. Awesome.
Yeah. Thank you,
got it.
Jason. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much. Y'all have a great one. Go outside, touch some grass like Jason is. Tell someone you love them randomly. I don't know. Have a good one, guys. Have a good night.
Bye.